in that plenary. It was just, quite amazing and good to understand the challenges and the practical ways that they can actually respond.
Definitely, De Graaf. I think the session on financing and on the investment case in particular happens at such a critical time. Whilst we're going through the GFA, the IMF and the World Bank are currently meeting to discuss how to get human capital development outcomes back on track. And I know coming into this Global Forum for Adolescents, we know that only 1.6% of all global development spend went towards adolescents. And that's quite catastrophic when you consider that there's 1.8 billion of us globally. And I think what the investment case has unpacked further is that if we don't act between now and 2035, the cost of inaction in terms of investing in adolescent health and well-being will be at around $20.5 trillion. That's 20.5 trillion with a big T. And I think the investment case sets out quite the clear areas of investment, reducing road traffic accidents, reducing child marriages, investing in mental health, investing in education and training, investing in HPV vaccines, are all critical areas of investments with exponential returns on investment for adolescents and young people. If you're following the finance session and the session on investments, I would urge you to continue to follow the money, but most importantly, let's look at holding our leaders accountable towards showing us the money and showing us more money as we move into the commitments session later today. And now on to our core sessions. The next round of them are coming up, so get ready to select which ones you'd want to join into. One is all about families. I think we all come from families, or we all have families of our own. And this session is really looking at how our families can support adolescents in challenging times. The session is called It Starts with Families, Improving Adolescent and Wellbeing Through Strengthened Support. There is, of course, another session, and it's about data. Yesterday we had the session on data by the group marker, and this one really builds upon that. And it's really talking about how can we progress if we can't measure the impact that policy and programming is having on adolescent health and well-being outcomes. So if you're a data nerd and if you like numbers and statistics, this is definitely a session for you. And this session is called Data That Matters, Championing Adolescent Well-being Measurements.
Wow, it all sounds pretty interesting. And meanwhile, we have an important wellbeing message from poet, model and activist Ebony Davis, plus some more exciting content. We have a recap from the Arab Forum for Adolescents. And by now, you know the drill. Enjoy the content and the sessions, and we'll see you in 50 minutes from now. See ya.
Unite! Unite! Rise! Unite! Lead! Lead!
Hello, my name is Ebony Davis, and I'm so honored to be present at this forum today. My path has been one of searching for my authenticity, searching for my authentic truth, and being bold and brave enough to walk in that unapologetically. And I know as a youth, I wish I heard those words. I wish I knew how powerful it was to own my truth, to walk in my truth, despite pressures from the outside world, despite programming from my family or my community, the place from which I came, to really trust my heart, trust my own intuition, trust my inner guidance, and know that it's gonna take me so much further than the opinions of others. So.
Good day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this session. I'm Dr. Isang Awa, Head of Advocacy at the Global Parenting Initiative, Department of Social Policy and Intervention, University of Oxford, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session, which is titled, It Starts with Families, Improving Adolescent Wellbeing Through Strengthened Family Support. I'll start the session with a brief presentation on the topic and then move on to a panel discussion with three fantastic panelists. There will be opportunities for questions for our panelists, so please share your questions in the chat. That said, I'll dive into my presentation right away. So adolescence is a critical period of development, and during this time, parents and caregivers are the primary sources of support and guidance for adolescents. Parenting has a profound and lasting impact on adolescents. Let me briefly explain what I mean by parenting and by caregiver. Parenting is the process of raising and nurturing children from infancy to adulthood, and caregiver is a person closely attached to the child and responsible for the child's daily care and support. For most children, their parents are their primary caregivers, but for many children without their biological parents, caregivers can include extended family members and people working in organized daycare facilities. I will use parents and caregivers interchangeably in my talk today. The way parents interact with and raise their adolescent children greatly influences the adolescent's development, behavior, and overall well-being. And I'll speak more about this later. But given the impact of parenting on adolescent well-being, it is important that all caregivers are supported to provide responsive, nurturing care to their children. The next slide, please. Adolescents face a range of threats to their well-being, which can have significant and long-lasting effects on their physical, mental, and emotional health. Threats include family conflict, academic pressure, bullying, cyberbullying, and so on. For adolescents affected by humanitarian crisis, the threats to their well-being significantly increase as they may go through physical abuse, sexual abuse, absence of school, food insecurity, harmful social norms, a strained relationship with their caregivers, orphanhood, or other adverse experiences. So threats to adolescents' well-being are real and many. And during crisis, they escalate in both numbers and intensity. But the situation is not hopeless. The next slide, please. Research indicates that globally, parenting practices influence adolescents' well-being. There is ample evidence that a nurturing, responsive parenting approach reduces adolescents' behavioral problems and has positive impact on the adolescent's psychological well-being, physical health, mental health, health behaviors, character, and even their academic achievement. So adolescent well-being can be improved by supporting parents and caregivers so that they provide nurturing, responsive parenting to their adolescents. The question then is, how can we support parents and caregivers? And my next slide speaks to that. The next slide, please. Parents can be supported through parenting programs, which are structured interventions that help parents learn skills and improve parenting behaviors along several dimensions. These improve parent-child interaction and the quality of parenting a child or adolescent receives, and so reduce harsh parenting. Most evidence-based programs have similar content and principles. There are several programs, including the Parenting for Lifelong Health programs, which were developed by researchers at the University of Oxford in collaboration with UNICEF, the WHO, and other partners. The next slide, please. Parenting programs have content on how to improve parent-adolescent interaction, promote communication and play, praise and encourage good behavior in adolescents, manage emotions of both parents and adolescents, promote clear instruction and rule setting, apply positive discipline, avoid harsh punishment, involve adolescents in problem solving, and promote love, attachment, and a sense of belonging for adolescents. The next slide, please. All parents and caregivers need some support to care for their children and adolescents, and some need all the support they can get. There are tiered parenting interventions with different intensities based on the level of support needed. Parenting programs can be delivered by professional or paraprofessional staff or peers, and even by the target populations at risk, depending on the intensity of the intervention. And parenting programs can be delivered to groups through weekly meetings over a period of time. They can also be integrated into existing services like health services, or combined with other components such as cash transfers for better impact. The next slide, please. And this slide shows us how parenting interventions work. We have the core content, which is evidence-based, adapted for the local context, and so on. As caregivers participate, they get knowledge and develop the skills that they need to positively parent, and this then produces positive child and adult outcomes, such as improved mental health for both parents and adolescents, and the society benefits as there is more human capital. The next slide, please. During humanitarian crisis, families go through various traumatic experiences such as displacement, hardships, and even death of loved ones, which have adverse effects on caregivers and their children. But there is evidence that even in these settings, parenting interventions help parents to cope and also provide mental health and psychosocial support for their children and adolescents. The Parenting for Lifelong Health team, with UN agencies and other partners, developed resources to support families affected by various crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic, conflicts in Ukraine and Sudan, and climate crisis in Pakistan, Turkey, and Syria. The next slide, please. Yes, this one. So this slide has quotes from adolescents whose parents use the Parenting for Lifelong Health resources. The quotes in the blue background are from the Pan-African User Testing of Parent app, the digital version of the Parenting for Lifelong Health for Teens program. And the quotes in yellow background are from adolescents whose caregivers received the parenting resources for families affected by the conflict in Ukraine. As you can see from the quotes, in both crisis and non-crisis settings, adolescents greatly benefit when parents and caregivers are supported. The next slide, please. Thank you for listening. And the next slide. Many thanks to our funders and partners for supporting us, for supporting our work and making this possible. The next slide, please. The next one. Great. I'm now going on to the panel discussion, and I want to first introduce our three amazing speakers that we have for the panel discussion. Our first speaker is Mr. Binza Joel. Binza Joel is a Parenting for Children in Crisis coordinator with Parenting for Lifelong Health charity, and his role focuses on providing parenting support in humanitarian settings. He's experienced in development policy advocacy, intervention planning, implementation, monitoring and evaluation. Binza has worked with several renowned organizations and collaborated with UNDP, WFP, and UNICEF on projects focusing on children's, youth's, and women's empowerment, food security, and health. Binza is based in South Sudan. And our next speaker is Maximina Jokonya, who is the Y+ stroke Her Voice Fund Coordinator. Maximina is an accomplished and driven social sciences professional with experience in HIV, SRHR, education, and gender equality. She has many years' experience in health programming with a focus on adolescent girls and young women, gender equality and women's empowerment, sexual reproductive health and rights, youth development, and leadership. Her experience also includes supporting children and young people living with HIV to access quality care through differentiated service delivery. Maximina is based in South Africa. And on our panel, we also have Kara Henderson, a Senior Program Officer, Global Early Adolescent Study, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Kara is a global health professional passionate about improving adolescent well-being by addressing gender inequality, social norms, and health disparities. She has experience in designing and managing mixed methods research studies and program evaluations in the nonprofit and higher education sectors, and has worked in both domestic and international settings, focusing on sexual and reproductive health, nutrition, women's empowerment, gender-based violence, and adolescent health. Her international experience includes working with multinational and community-based organizations in Côte d'Ivoire, Morocco, South Africa, and Ethiopia. Kara is based in the US. We're now going to hear from Binza and Maximina.
So my first question is for Binza. Binza, you have a lot of experience working in fragile settings. From your experience, what are the top stressors for families experiencing crisis?
Thank you, Isang. It is important to recognize that humanitarian crisis presents challenges that are deeply intertwined with the specific context of situations. And families and caregivers in particular endure remarkable difficulties during such times. Drawing from my own experience, raised by a single mother in a refugee setting, and my work with the parents in crisis situations, I have come to understand a number of significant challenges that families face. These challenges span economic, social, psychological dimensions, and it is important to acknowledge that I can only scratch the surface of their complexity. The emotional and psychological impacts during crisis are undeniable. Families navigate a roller coaster of emotions ranging from the paralyzing grip of fear and anxiety to overwhelming waves of grief and anger. These intense feelings strain family bonds and take a severe toll on the mental well-being of both parents and children. Not only that, access to basic needs is a big challenge. We see that in most cases, securing essential resources like food, water, shelter, and medications become a daily battle during crisis. The unrelenting struggle to meet these basic needs heightens stress levels as parents grapple with the constant pressure to provide for their children. Furthermore, I want to highlight that parents have a deep concern about their children's well-being. This encompassing worries about their safety, access to education, and emotional health. The disruption of schools, for instance, and the limited social interactions and the crisis in this crisis impacts on children's mental well-being and serve as a significant stressors for parents. Finally, it is crucial to acknowledge that individuals cope with stress differently. This is from my experience as a child in a refugee camp. Some may turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms. Parents may slip into alcohol abuse, and teenagers may begin to misuse substances or abuse substances, which can further strain family dynamics and result in lasting negative consequences for both parents and children. As such, understanding these stresses in families experiencing crisis is essential for providing support they need. And we must recognize the mental health and well-being of parents and children as a top priority. By addressing these stresses and offering resources and assistance, we can help families navigate crisis more effectively and foster resilience in the face of adversity.
Thank you, Binza. That's quite enlightening. And are there any good examples of family-based support for families in humanitarian settings?
Indeed, there are a number of commendable examples of family-based support during and in the aftermath of emergencies. For instance, the Parenting for Lifelong Health Parenting in Crisis Initiatives, which is an evidence-based intervention that has proven to be very effective in supporting parents during crisis. This open source parenting resource can be adopted to various crisis situations, as they have been during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Ukraine crisis, Pakistan floods, Syria, Turkey earthquake, and currently in Sudan conflict, and it has reached millions of people. They offer not only practical tips to parents in support of their mental well-being, ensuring positive parenting, but contribute the resilience of families to navigate crisis. These resources have been effectively utilized to deliver a hybrid responses encompassing various channels such as social media and radio to widespread dissemination. And they have also been employed in direct in-person interactions with families. For instance, our partners in Pakistan have seamlessly integrated these resources into their school in-box programs and harnessed their power in workshops for parents and caregivers. Another example is the community-based support network, an initiative from the World Without Orphan, which is the Hope Groups, which brings together community members. These are women and men together to offer emotional and practical assistance during difficult times. These networks fosters a profound sense of solidarity, creating a safety net for families in crisis. Another invaluable aspect of family-based support is the livelihood assistance and the cash-based transfer. These I'm drawing from my experience with the children associated with armed forces and armed groups in South Sudan. Families are often, they lose livelihood during crisis. This makes life very challenging to meet basic needs. When they were to be integrated into community, partners provided financial assistance to the families of these children, allowing them to address immediate necessities. In the process, empowered them to make choices that best suited their unique circumstances. Not only that, livelihood support, which included vocational trainings and microfinance opportunities, helped parents regain financial stability and ensure that the well-being of their children, catering for their school fees, healthy diets, and medication. I've given this example to highlight the diversity of services and interventions within family-based support in emergencies. While they promote the well-being of individual family members, they also contribute to the overall resilience of communities facing crisis. As policymakers, development partners, and humanitarian actors, it is critical to have a deliberate investment strategy for the pre-crisis preparedness, active crisis response, and the post-crisis resilience and recovery efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Binza. That's amazing. It's good to know that there are good examples of family-based support for families that are affected by emergencies. And I'm sure that many people in the call today in this meeting will probably like to know more about these examples. So before you leave, if you can put in links to some of these resources, that would be amazing. Thank you again. And I'll go on to the next speaker. Our next speaker, Maximina Jokonya, is a leading activist for adolescent girls and young women living with HIV through the Her Voice network. Maximina, welcome again. And could you tell us more about the advocacy efforts you're leading and what challenges you're facing?
Thank you so much. So what do we know so far as HYW and also in the HIV response when it comes to adolescent girls and young women? We know that as adolescent girls and young women continue to be the first and the bearer of HIV with increased vulnerabilities that are really, increased time and again with social disasters that come in, environmental disasters. We can name a few. We know COVID-19 was one of them. We know that at the back of every challenge that we are facing, there are also punitive laws and legislations that really impede us from having access to services that we want and need as adolescent girls and young women. We can talk about, the LGBTQI bill that the anti-bill that was really recently ascended in Uganda, and how that then affects us as young women in our diversity in terms of accessibility to services, but also the danger that we are now in terms of, us facing violence and also abuse. Just to name a few of the challenges that we are facing. We can talk about young women who are breastfeeding, but also living with HIV, and we are being criminalized of us just breastfeeding our children. So in this topic that we're talking about family-based support, what does that even mean now when we're talking about the communities that are criminalizing us of just doing our duties as young mothers, for example? We know as well that there are structural, social, and economical barriers that are in place that really drive some of the challenges that we face as adolescent girls and young women, and really puts us at higher risk of, HIV infection. We can talk about, as every week as adolescent girls, we are constantly being, recorded in every publication that comes out that we are constantly being infected by HIV. We are constantly be the ones that are at higher risk of violence, when there's gender-based violence and all other violence that are against adolescents and young women in general. So all of these and at different, intersections, we know that who is at the center of being, facing all of this is an adolescent girl and young women. Other challenges, and I think my previous speakers already also mentioned around climate change, around migration. We then find ourselves being disjointed with our families, but also we find ourselves in refugee camps where we then are more susceptible to other risks in terms of abuse, gender-based violence in those camps, but also no access to even services that we need as adolescent girls and young women. So at the center of this, we know that when it comes to family support and also communities, it is already disjointed. And in the context that we're also living, we are also finding ourselves being in a cultural kind of controlled environment where we have to conform to certain values, to certain norms, in a way that then kind of put us even at more risk, because we know some of the practices that are still in place are still promoting some of these harmful norms in order for us to have access to services, but also violating our rights, violating our body at the end of the day. So what exactly are we saying when it comes to family support, family-based support, and what is the role of the communities to take responsibility so that as young women, as adolescent girls, we are safe, we are promoting our health, and our rights are also being observed at the end of the day. I remember last week I was in Zambia, in a district that is in Zambia, where they're actually practicing the issues of harmful laws. They're still doing the rite of passage, where as early as 10, you have to go to certain practice, you have to taught how to please a man and everything. So I could imagine a 10-year-old me as an AGYW. What does it even mean? My rights being violated, I'm being exposed to certain things that I'm not understanding, but also some of the practices that I go where I have to be cut on my body, everything. All of that really encompasses into the topic that you're talking about, which is family-based support and the values that we want for them to actually support us as adolescent girls and young women. As a Voice Fund, like what we mentioned before, a Voice Fund is around an initiative that we are working as adolescent girls and young women across 13 African countries, where we are looking at what we call the socio-ecological system or approach, where we are really centering AGYW as an agent of change. So here's what we've discovered and what we are pushing as adolescent girls and young women is that if we are not in the forefront, if we are not the ones that are taking charge in terms of other issues that affect us, other challenges, other laws that are affecting us, no one is coming to our rescue. So what we are doing with your Voice Fund is we are empowering us as AGYW through different mechanisms, be it training. We are equipping ourselves on how to do advocacy, for example. How do we formulate our objectives, and how do we approach the target audience, who are our policymakers? How do we show up in a space and make sure that they are addressing our needs when it comes to health and rights? They are respecting and they are valuing our expertise as adolescent girls and young women. When it comes to family support, we know it's also part of the socio-ecological model, where we are also working with caregivers, parents, on how to really, facilitate a dialogue, what you call family matters, where we need to really bring it up again, because we know in the early days, yes, our parents used to have those dialogues, but somewhere along the way it died. Where now, as in the Generation Z, we no longer want to interact with our parents, and our parents are doing their own things, while us are doing our own things. So we're trying to bring back that platform, that environment for us to just have a dialogue. What are the current issues are we facing as adolescent girls and young women? And how can parents and caregivers also support us in terms of what we want and what we need when it comes to services, for example? And then we move on to the community. How does community take responsibility in some of those cultural norms that I've talked about? How do they keep them? How do they make sure that us as AGYW living in this community are not in harmful way? We are not being violated, for example. So it is them being champions and also advocating for some of these practices to be completely removed, so that we have access to services, but also our rights are also being respected, for example. Then lastly, that I'm going to mention is around Her Voice Fund working with policymakers, where we are saying at the level where the decisions are being made, key decision-making platforms, whether it's a process that is happening in country regarding a certain policy that speaks to us as adolescent girls and young women, we are always there. We are advocating for our issues to be prioritized, to be documented, to be part of the policies that are being currently developed and they're going to pass in their parliaments. So we are supporting ourselves, because we know at the end of the day, they will never open a door for us. They will never provide a chair. They will never provide a table for us. We are bringing our own. We are saying, even though we are not providing all of these things that we need, we are still going to come at that decision-making platform, and we are going to table our issues that we want to see changing in our lives, so that at the end of the day, we are able to realize our own health, our own well-being, and also our rights are being really observed at the end of the day. So lastly, what I can say is that unless we start doing development differently and just being intentional about, addressing certain issues that we are facing as adolescent girls and young women, not just to talk about it, but just to have interventions that are led by young people, adolescent girls and young women. Then we have support from different structures, whether it's family, community, as a holistic approach. I am sure we will not win in this response that we are trying to push, especially in the HIV response. Hence, this is a really important conversation that we are having today. Thank you so much, Isanga. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing these challenges and the advocacy efforts with us. And, just being on this platform and telling us, speaking so passionately about this to us is great advocacy work that you're doing. I want to ask, what can be done to mitigate these challenges, and where do you think we need to be investing more?
Yes, as I think we need to really start thinking about how do we come as a collective, looking at us as young women, implementers. We also need to bring together the donors as well to come on board and have a collective kind of interaction and realistic dialogue in terms of where's the current gap, right? What are the challenges that young people are facing? And you hear directly from us where we call it ethical and meaningful engagement of young women, for example, not policymakers, implementers coming in with their own ideas, and they come with intervention and say, oh, we have come with an intervention for HYWs, run with it. We will not run with it. That's something that we're imposing on us. We are not tokenistic, right?
Absolutely.
We want to be really engaged from design of the design of the idea to the actual work plan, to the implementation, to monitoring and evaluation, all along with us. We don't want to be engaged and consulted and then to drop us. So that's the first thing that I need even for policymakers, government, donors that are even in this space to really understand. That's doing development differently. So if we get it right there, we then now look at what is the current financial mechanisms are in place and how can we invest more in communities, but also in HYW-led organizations or young women's or women's-led organizations, for example. Many times we find out that, donors will then want to come and say, oh, we're going to invest in big organizations with different structures in place. But if we look at it, the most left behind is the HYW-led network or initiative that is down in the rural areas, where literally no one wants to come in and do an intervention. They want to come in towns. They will say, oh, we've reached adolescent girls and young women. But us who are in the rural areas, we don't even know what is a PrEP is. We don't even know the interventions that are in place. So I think we need to start thinking about it. Where is the need to, where we want to move it, and how can we reach those that are most left behind? So which means every programming that we're going to start to think about, let's be intentional about it, right? And the finances, the funding itself, it's really important. I think it's high time where we also need to really invest in this socio-ecological model that I've talked about, empowering an adolescent girl, young women, or young women in general in our diversities. Then also look at how do we also invest in family support systems, which is super important. Then we move on to the community as well, because I think if we only support one piece of the component, it might not work, because if you empower me as an adolescent girl, young man, I'm gonna go back to the family. This is where I live. I'm gonna go back to the communities where I'm still facing the cultural norms and harms that are still there. So how do we make sure that at each level we are investing and we are doing a holistic kind of approach when it comes to investing? But also want to also look at how do they make it more intentional, because we know the funding is going down, right? And no one wants to really invest in us as communities, but also in the family support kind of approach or innovation. We are asking all the donors that are here, and more broadly, please invest in us. Make sure that whatever funding that is out there, we are also part and parcel of your funding portfolio. We can do it. We can implement our own initiatives. We are able to achieve the results that we need. And we know with this family support kind of structure, we are able to achieve so much. Thank you so much. Over to you, Isaac. I have so much to share, but let me end here. Over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maximina. Before we go to our next speaker, we will take a few questions for Binza or Maximina. And Maximina, if you have questions, please add them in the chat. There's a question here for Binza. It says, Binza, how do you think parenting support can be integrated into humanitarian responses? Sorry, Binza, I think we can't hear you. Apologies for that. I think Binza's mic is muted, but it should be back in a minute. We're going to get that sorted. And while we're waiting for Binza, there's another question here for Maximina. So I'm going to take that first, and then if we have time, we will go back to Binza. And Maximina, this is for you. How can we support youth advocates and youth-led organizations to increase community-level support?
Thank you so much, Issa. Can you hear me, just to confirm?
Yes, I can hear you. Could you hear me? Did you hear my question?
Yes, I did. I did.
Okay, great. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. So I think the first thing that we need to really consider is around first of all the capacity building. So the capacity building really comes in two ways, right? So there's capacity building for the young advocates who are going to be the agents of change. So we need to make sure that whatever change we want to see happening in our communities or in our policies that we want to influence, they have the capacity to deliver on that, which means we need to invest not only doing the trainings online and trainings on face to face, then you say it's done. What about going further? What about mentorship? What about connecting them to the rightful platforms where they can continuously increase their skills, their knowledge, being connected to what is currently happening in the world in terms of HIV response or SRHR or the policy world. So this is what we are trying to really improve and encourage. Secondly, it's around capacitating the actual organization, the youth-led organization that is based in the rural areas. That is where we need to invest more to make sure that even their internal systems are well equipped for them to even apply for bigger funding. Right now, if we look at the youth-led organizations, they don't want to invest in us because they know, they will say you don't have this policy, you don't have this strategy in place. At the same time, we are the ones that are doing the actual work on the grounds. We are the advocates. We are the ones that are pushing the policies. We are the ones that are continuously, demanding for the services that we need. So we know what we want. We know how to do the work. Sometimes we might not have all the policies that we need, all the papers, all the procedures, but we are capable of doing so much more. So we are saying, in order for us to then receive the funding, also invest in our internal systems, in our organizational development, for us to then be at that level where you want us to be, for us to then be eligible for any funding that is out there. I think those are some of the things. And also, how do we also then support young people to then be connected and collaborating with other organizations? That mentorship, that well-established organization, whether it's a civil society or other community-based organization that is well-established, how can they come in place and also support a youth-led organization that is starting up without you imposing, but just giving the room for the youth-led organization to actually implement their own ways and be able to start and grow with themselves with your mentorship as well. I think those are some of the things that I can also really share at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Maximina. And I was just about to stop it, but that's really great. Thank you. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, and hopefully we'll be able to take a question for Binza later on. So our next speaker, Kara Honerson, whom I introduced earlier, has been working with Johns Hopkins University on the Global Early Adolescent Study. Kara, what does the evidence say on the relationship between social norms and parenting?
Thank you, Isan. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So first, I just want to thank the other speakers who spoke to so many of the important issues about families and caregiving for adolescents. It's such a central piece of the adolescent experience. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what that means, and especially what that means around social norms and gender norms in communities. So next slide, please. So first, I'll talk a little bit about what is the Global Early Adolescent Study. You can go ahead to the next slide. So the Global Early Adolescent Study looks at how gender norms impact the health and well-being of very young adolescents, which is ages 10 to 14, as they grow up into older adolescents and adults. So why are we looking at this? We see from the evidence that early adolescence is a critical window for gender norm formation and gender norm transformative interventions. But what do we mean by gender norms? Well, until recently, there wasn't much research on how adolescents, and especially young adolescents, perceive gender norms. And by gender norms, we mean the social rules of behaving as a male or female, and then how adolescents respond to those rules, and how they change across adolescent years. We then look at how these social expectations placed on adolescents influence their health and well-being. You can move on to the next slide. So our goals with the Global Early Adolescent Study, which is the largest globally representative longitudinal study exploring gender norms and their implications, we are seeking to understand how gender as a social system informs health and well-being across adolescence, and how this process unfolds in different sociocultural contexts. We are also, as part of this, in some of our sites, testing how gender transformative interventions that happen during early adolescence can contribute to improving adolescent health and well-being. You can move to the next slide. This is just a snapshot of where we work. You can see that we are representing all continents across the world, and we work in primarily urban poor settings. You can move to the next slide as well. Okay, so now I will speak a little bit about our results and what we found through this work. Next slide. So why do gender norms matter in early adolescence? Well, what we found, and what is contrary to what many people might believe, we have found that young people and young adolescents, even at age 10, perceive unequal gender norms. We've also found that these unequal norms tend to solidify with age. That means that they become more central to the adolescent experience. And we've then found that these gender, can you go back to the last slide, please? Thank you. We've also found that gender unequal norms inform many health outcomes. This includes their relationships, whether it's romantic relationships or with their peers. It affects their experiences of violence and bullying, and it affects their experience of mental health. And these effects vary by culture, and they can inform very specific behaviors. Now you can move to the next slide. So the key messages that we have found with the GEAS are that we now have a greater understanding of gender norms among young adolescents. We know that they're complex, that they're fluid, and that they're influenced by young people's social environment. We also know that gender norms are social determinants of adolescent health. We know that they can predict many different behaviors, and then they can change according to adolescent experiences. We also know that different gender norm perceptions can predict different behaviors. This was a lot of information, so I think I'll pause for now and see if there are any questions first before I move on to how we have addressed some of these normative beliefs. Thank you for this question. I'll definitely get into this in some of my next slides, but I'll first share that I think that we've seen that finding space and time for families to interact is often one of the biggest barriers to participating in an intervention. Maximina mentioned this earlier, that adolescents do their own things, parents do their own things, and sometimes it's hard to find that time. This is especially true in disadvantaged households where caregivers have to work multiple jobs or are unable to access childcare, maybe for younger children. But we found that some factors could be addressed to help engage parents. This includes engaging other institutions that families are connected to, such as religious institutions or schools. Holding activities that involve the whole family in some way, as opposed to just maybe the adolescent children, so that childcare is not as much of an issue. And then bringing families together can promote participation and closeness both at whatever program as well as when they return home. And then the last thing I'll just mention is engaging fathers has definitely been the most challenging aspect and often takes direct outreach from other men or community leaders. So having this buy-in from influential men and community leaders at the start of an intervention is really important. Sure. So, as I mentioned, we find that normative beliefs start to appear at an early age and tend to solidify over time. So, prior to adolescence, children mostly rely on their families and parents for social norms and cues. But in young adolescents, they start to look to friends or peers, even though their behaviors are still largely controlled by their caregivers. Well, once they reach older adolescence, these norms have been reinforced by their institutions and communities, and they might start exhibiting these norms themselves. So, when we think about intervention, we really have to understand that normative beliefs start early. And what you are presenting or teaching your kids matters because they are internalizing everything. Absolutely. So, the next two slides, I think you can move forward. So we conducted what's called a human-centered design process, which means that we created a new package of interventions with young people at the center. This is really about what Maximina was speaking about having young people be the ones designing these programs. And we are in this process addressing the fact that caregivers are really important and need to also be involved. We need that multi-level intervention that includes the communities, the families, the institutions, as opposed to just targeting adolescents. So you can move to the next slide. So this is, I know, a lot, and this is, I don't expect everyone to read what's on here, but this was our theory of change, and it speaks to, on the top are the gender norms that we wanted to focus on. The second row is the design imperatives. So when we were creating these interventions, what were the values and the things that we thought were important in order to ensure that young people and their caregivers are equally heard and represented? That third row are the interventions that we wound up creating, and it included everything from a family class that brings whole families together to learn and grow together, to an exhibition that was an art exhibition that brought the whole community together to share experiences of violence and mental health that adolescents experience on a daily basis. That second to last row there is the population that was affected by that intervention. So like I mentioned, we reached adolescents, caregivers and families, teachers, community leaders, and entire institutions to make sure that we were creating a holistic approach. And then that last row there is some of the norms that we attempted to change to create that supportive environment and how we were able to change them. Move to the next slide. This seems to be a different version of the slides than I shared, but this is one of the activities that we did in the family class. And the purpose of this activity was to take users on a journey from thinking about their own experiences to understanding others' experiences, and then working together to improve communication and relationships. Because what we found is that there are many interventions that try to address a whole host of issues for young adolescents. But at the core, at the foundation, it's really about just building connection and communication between parents and caregivers and adolescents. And that if we can just bridge that challenge and bridge that need of just spending time together and connecting, we can open the door to other interventions.
Must go beyond theoretical insights. They carry a call to action. So let's take the inspiration and knowledge that we've gained here today and translate it into real-world actions. Let's strive to be parents, caregivers, and mentors who empower our adolescents to live happy, healthy, and fulfilling lives. Thank you, everybody. And if you still have questions, please share them, and we'll see how we can get the panelists to respond to the different questions, including those that have already been shared. Thank you again, everybody.